Our brave ancestors who had been enslaved would walk for miles and days upon days, knowing full well the trek they made may in fact assure their bane. They suffered many perils and indignities, praying to see the fruition of their dreams. They stayed patient, and God made a way. And though hard, their journey would not be in vain. But never quite distant was the baying of hounds. Hanging in the air with terror abound, their former captors pursuing them for miles around, never succeeding in wearing them down. They came through many toils and snares, the likes of which we could never compare. But they stayed brave, never surrendering to fear nor doubt. This, among other things, made their courage profound.
Canada was widely known as the land of freedom, yet the security of freedom seekers was far from certain even once they reached these shores. With varying degrees of success, slave catchers frequently made incursions into Sandwich, other border communities, or even locations farther in the interior, in pursuit of their so-called human property. On multiple occasions, enslavers attempted to use the courts to arrange for the extradition of the self-emancipated. Generally, the colonial government of Upper Canada and later Canada West upheld the promise of granting legal freedom to Underground Railroad travelers. This policy became more widely understood after the famous Blackburn case of 1833.
In 1985, I was running a new program for school children called the Archaeological Resource Center. I wanted to find a site that would speak to the immigrant heritage of many of the students, to the feeling of a new world that many of the students' families had engaged in. I wanted them to see achievement. We tripped over the Blackburn site, which was on the property. It's the oldest school board owned property in the city. It's now the Inglenook Community School. Under the playground, we found the remains of a little house, a barn, and a mysterious cellarway. And the city directories for the 1850s said that the person who lived there, the person who was the householder, and I'm quoting from an historical document, was Thornton Blackburn, cabman, colored. And I thought, isn't that interesting? Here's a Black man owning a taxi business in downtown Toronto in the 1850s. I wonder if this is an Underground Railroad story. And so it proved. We found Thornton's tombstone in the Toronto Necropolis Cemetery, and it said he was born in Maysville, Kentucky, and he was born about 1812, time of the War of 1812. And we proceeded to do the excavation, but at the same time, we were doing a major research project. And I have no idea what made me pull a book off a shelf in a library on the history of Detroit when I was doing this research, but I did. And there it said that the first racial riot in the city of Detroit had occurred in 1833 because a man by the name of Thornton Blackburn and his wife Rutha, now her name in Toronto was Lucie. It took me years before I realized they were the same person, but there couldn't be that many Thornton Blackburns. He and his wife had been recaptured by Kentucky slave catchers and were about to be sent back to slavery.
Lucie, originally known as Ruthie Blackburn, was born enslaved in approximately 1803, reputedly somewhere in the Caribbean, and died in Toronto in 1895. Thornton Blackburn was born in approximately 1812 in Maysville, Kentucky, and died in Toronto in 1890. They met as enslaved people in Louisville, Kentucky, and fled north together in 1831 to live in freedom.
Lucie and Thornton left Louisville, Kentucky. They had free papers. There had to be a conspiracy of people who understood what they needed to help them even escape from Louisville, Kentucky, with free papers, since neither of them was literate.
After they were discovered living in Detroit in 1833, they were jailed with the expectation that they would be returned to slavery. However, anti-slavery activists and supporters rallied around the jail, leading to the so-called Blackburn riots of 1833.
People came, here's your transnationalism, people came from Upper Canada, from Amherstburg and Sandwich, across the river. Some of these people had fled slavery themselves. This was risking their own freedom. And they came across to help the Black community of Detroit rescue the Blackburns and get them across to Sandwich.
In separate dramatic incidents, both Blackburns were freed by supporters and assisted across the river to safety. But because a law enforcement official had been badly injured in the uprising, their enslavers collaborated with U.S. authorities, most notably the mayor of Detroit, to have the Blackburns return to the United States to stand trial. Their premise was that the Blackburns had incited the riot.
The Blackburn story teaches us that you can't hold people down when they have a large network of like-minded friends, because the Blackburn network was extensive on both sides of the river. And it is because of that, when people congregated around the jail where Lucie was incarcerated, those people are really responsible for helping them escape the jail. And then people were waiting at the bottom of the Detroit River to take them away. And those were both Afro-Canadians and African Americans, and also many whites who participated in that rescue for Lucie and Thornton.
Mrs. Blackburn was spirited out of the Detroit jail under cover of night in another lady's dress. It was George French and his wife, and Mrs. French was the one who wore Lucie's dress in the jail, and Lucie Blackburn got across to Amherstburg. She actually stayed in Amherstburg where they had friends. They were involved with the Baptist church in Amherstburg, and strong connections with the Baptist church in Sandwich and in Detroit, even this early. And the next day, Thornton was snatched from the door of the jailhouse and taken off in a wild ride down to the river. And he and 7 of his rescuers came across. This was June 17th. They arrived about 6 o'clock, June 17th, on the shores at Sandwich, where Thornton and all of his rescuers were thrown into jail. And then the William Hands, who was the local sheriff, went and got Lucie and she called herself Lucie after she reached Canadian soil. She never used the name Rutha again, so I call her Lucie because that's how she self-identified. But Mrs. Blackburn was brought to the jail, and the judges there were 3 judges at Sandwich, and one of them was absolutely adamant that he was going to send the Blackburns back across the river because the mayor of Detroit had accused them of trying to kill Sheriff Wilson, who was badly beaten up in the riot, but Thornton didn't have anything to do with it, and Mrs. Blackburn wasn't even there, and of arousing the very civil unrest that rescued Thornton. And again, Mrs. Blackburn wasn't even in town, but they were charged with they were going to be charged with these 2 crimes. And that was very significant because they weren't accused of being freedom seekers. They were accused of 2 felonies. And to extradite anybody, you have to have committed a felony. Well, there was a new law had been passed in February of 1833, and it was called the Fugitive Offenders Act, and this was the first trial case.
The Blackburn story is just rife with information about the international conspiracy that took place to help hide them, guide them, and shelter them in Detroit and again in Canada. And of course, the international intrigue about whether they should be sent back and how that really started a whole set of extradition laws between the US and Canada. So it was basically an international incident.
This is not a white hero story. This is not about white abolitionists saving people. This is about the African Americans and African Canadians and their agency, their decision-making, and their courage in joining their hands across that border and helping people make free.
While the extradition requests were being considered, the Blackburns were arrested and held in the Western District Jail in Sandwich. Desperate to avoid re-enslavement and likely separation from his wife, Thornton, who was both illiterate and without legal representation, dictated a letter which was transcribed at the jail, reputedly by the Reverend William Johnson of St. John's Anglican Church.
Finally, the judges sent to Toronto well, it was the town of York then, wasn't Toronto till 1834, and asked Sir John Colborne and his executive council to rule on whether the Blackburns should be extradited. And this began a long series of back and forth, including a major petition from Thornton written at the jail. He didn't write, he couldn't read and write, but it was drafted for him, supposedly by the minister at St. John's Anglican Church. But I found a draft copy of that in Charles Askin's own papers. My thought has always been it was actually Charles Askin, who was a local justice of the peace later himself. Charles Askin's a major figure in early sandwich history, and I think he actually was behind this petition. The slave catchers had done something very clever. They had hired every lawyer in Sandwich. So there was nobody to defend the Blackburns. But this petition really had a lot to do with turning the tide.
Thornton's letter was forwarded to Sir John Colborne. Seeing clearly that there was no truth to the claims that he and Lucie were to be returned to the United States to face charges related to the uprising, Thornton said, "Your petitioner is convinced that the object of the party is to have him and his wife carried back to hopeless slavery, where complaints can neither be heard nor grievances redressed." John Colborne, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada at the time, and Attorney General Robert Simpson Jameson, determined that it was illegal to return the Blackburns to the United States, where their punishment, re-enslavement, would be greater than any penalty they could face for an equivalent crime in Upper Canada. In so doing, they established a precedent that would protect future freedom seekers legally from extradition requests of that kind. Indeed, some legal scholars have argued that this marked the genesis of Canada's refugee reception policy.
And Robert Simpson Jameson, who was the Attorney General of Upper Canada, finally wrote back and said, look, even though you're saying they committed these felonies, they're not actually felonies. Escaping from jail isn't a felony. The other thing that's wrong with your petition is we realize that these people had escaped from bondage, and really what you want them back for is that. You want to send them back to slaveholders.
The Blackburns, once freed, settled briefly in Amherstburg before relocating permanently to Toronto. There, they continued to live lives of dignity and meaning, including establishing Toronto's first taxi service, horse and carriage based, of course, in 1837. They were involved in abolitionism and philanthropy aimed at helping freedom seekers resettle successfully. They hosted multiple freedom seekers in their home. As an abolitionist, Thornton attended the North American Convention of Colored Freedmen held in Toronto in 1851, and served as vice president of the Canadian Mill and Mercantile Association, which established job creation projects such as mills, industries, and a general store in the Elgin settlement. Remarkably, Thornton discovered his brother Alfred living in Toronto, and in 1837 he courageously returned to Kentucky, following the Underground Railroad routes in reverse to rescue their mother, Sibby. Today, Thornton and Lucie Blackburn are recognized as persons of national historic significance in Canada, with a federal heritage plaque located in Toronto. Other commemorations include, but are not limited to, the Thornton and Lucie Blackburn Conference Center at George Brown College. And it's no wonder. Theirs is a remarkable story of slavery, the Underground Railroad, and freedom.
It's just a beautiful story. It's a story of love. It's a love story. It's a story of determination. It's a story of community cooperation. It's a story of mystery. It has all the makings of a series, a TV series, that they don't have to imagine scenes or incidents for it. They're already there.
They couldn't read and write, and they had no children. Within a generation of their passing, their story was forgotten.
I like to say that the truth is stranger than fiction. And in the case of the Blackburn, fiction cannot top their actual story.
Wading through waters deep, with heavy souls and blackened feet, made the destination of freedom a dream so sweet. on silent yet still frightful nights, guided solely by the North Star's light, with hopes and dreams of rightful freedom. This would drive and also lead them. Hastened by memories of cracking whips with empty guts and thirsty lips, but alas, the journey would well be worth it, because they fled in faith and walked with courage. With hope and their goal in mind, they walked by faith and not by sight. To tend flocks all their own, working their fingers to the bone, tilling earth to call their home, this was all vast in store, a gift granted by the Lord. I'm proud to say 50 years have gone and more, and we've reaped the benefit of their reward. I praise them for walking through freedom's door. Though they feared death, they craved freedom more. I hold my head high with pride, because their dream and legacy has become my life. I hear the songs of Negro spirituals, and I read their bold tales. I'm proud to say I ride their coattails. My soul soars, my heart swells with such boundless joy when I hear them, because I follow in the footsteps of those who crossed the river to freedom.
Years later, God put pen to